As we continue to celebrate Black History Month, we introduce you to an Alton World War II veteran, the late James Killion Jr.
He was one of 125,000 Black American soldiers to serve overseas during the war, making up just over 6% of all soldiers abroad. But what makes his story even more unique is the detailed account he left for future generations to see. It's a letter written nearly 80 years ago.
I believe that this war will be an important factor for my race. Dad, as 1944 went out and 45 jumped in, I was on my knees thanking God for taking care of me and praying from the depths of my heart that he will continue to do so.
James Killion III cherishes this letter and many others from his father. It's because they chronicle
he was there fighting for our country.
What it was like being a black soldier during World War II.
But he couldn't actually fight. He couldn't go on the front lines.
A native of Alton, James Harrison Killion Jr. enlisted in the Army in 1936 after dropping out of high school.
You couldn't even get a factory job as a black man. And so there weren't a lot of jobs available, but high school wasn't working for him, and he was frustrated.
Killion spent his first 3 years in the Army at a training camp in Arizona. He then returned to Alton.
He came back, finished high school, and then World War II broke out, and he was called back.
By then, Killion's life had drastically changed. He had met and married his wife, Hazel, and they were expecting their first child. In a letter he wrote to his mom after arriving at a camp in Wyoming, he asked about his family.
Have you seen my Hayes? When you see her or call her, ask her how our little stranger is coming along.
That little stranger, James Killion III, was born May 7, 1944. By then, James Killion had been sent to France, managing a prisoner of war camp.
He was over the day-to-day operation, tasking them on what they needed to do as far as projects, making sure that they were well taken care of.
The Killion family says James developed a special bond with many of the German and Russian prisoners.
At one time they had an intake, and there were some Russian prisoners. And one of them, he states, was as brown as he was. And he said the guy immediately called him bro, and they shook hands, and he gave him some kind of medal. And he said, I wanted to be that guy's friend. He said, but I couldn't because of my role and because he was a POW.
Killion had such a rapport with one of the prisoners, he received an amazing gift. Who are we looking at here?
Yours truly, yeah, James Killion III. From pictures that my mom had sent of me as a young infant, he was able to replicate that. I wish I could meet the artist. Yeah, it's just amazing that somebody would do that, and that he had that kind of rapport where a guy would actually feel comfortable in doing that or wanting to do that.
Killion's children say their father was often treated better by enemy forces. In a letter dated November 27, 1944, he wrote,
Maybe it's wrong for me to say, but since I've been over here, I've learned more about the American white man that has put me against him. And I know things will be a lot different in days to come. I used to think that they were okay, but I really know them now, and I'll never forget.
His fellow black soldiers at that time, they were very patriotic. They wanted to fight for the country. That's the irony of it. They wanted to fight. They wanted to contribute. They wanted to fend for America.
After the war, Killion Jr. returned to Alton and finally got to meet his son, who was nearly 2 years old. He got a job at Laclede Steel in Alton, joining the CIO union, where he became the first black elected official of the mostly white union. He had 4 children with his wife, Hazel. The kids say their dad had a big impact on them and the city of Alton, working to break down systemic racist barriers. There's even a park in Alton named in his honor.
I still have people that come to me and say, you know, your dad was a role model for me.
Years ago, the 47 letters written by Staff Sergeant Killion were passed on to his son.
They sat for years.
But this past Christmas, James Killion III decided it was time to do something with the letters. He put them in a book for all of his family to have.
When we opened up the package Christmas, and there's this picture, Daddy, soldier, and a book.
A special gift about a special man. But the story doesn't end there. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans recently heard about Killion's letters and soon it will house them in its history archives. The Killion family says it's important for the nation and the world to hear their father's story.
One of the biggest challenges we face right now is that people of color, students of color, they don't feel connected because they don't know their history because it's not taught. And that's one of the things that I think is so important about this.